So if you looked at a map of Europe in, like, the year 500.
Right after the Roman Empire really fell apart.
Exactly. And you saw this fragmented, just totally chaotic mess that was the region of Gaul. I mean, you would probably bet your life savings that a unified kingdom of France was mathematically impossible.
Oh, absolutely. You'd lose that bet, but you'd be totally justified in making it.
Because it was a geographic nightmare of isolated regions. The people living there couldn't even understand each other's languages, which is crazy to think about now.
Yeah, the linguistic divide was massive.
And the local warlords held, like, infinitely more physical power than anyone claiming to be a central king. By every conventional metric of how we think nations are built, it just shouldn't have worked.
Right. Structural rigidity,
Yeah.
massive standing armies, an iron grip on resources. They had none of that.
Exactly. This state really should have collapsed under its own weight.
It is entirely counterintuitive to how we are taught history, honestly. I mean, we generally look at historical superpowers through this lens of brute force and centralized architecture.
Right, like the Romans. You build the walls high, you crush internal dissent with a massive military.
You project overwhelming physical dominance? Yeah. But the survival and eventual absolute dominance of the French state from the early Middle Ages right through the Renaissance, it completely subverts that model.
And that subversion is exactly what we are exploring today on this deep dive. We are looking at a deeply fascinating, highly unconventional set of research notes.
The ones titled simply, Liz Kingdom of France.
Yes, Liz Kingdom of France. Now, normally, an analysis of medieval history from, say, 500 to 1500 CE is a dry recounting of dates, battles, and dynastic marriages.
So dry. Just endless genealogy.
Endless. But the author of these notes takes a completely different path. They filter 1,000 years of French state building through a very specific modern psychological framework.
It's such a unique approach. They basically argue that the Kingdom of France survived by acting like a psychological subpersonality they call Liz.
Which is wild. So to understand the entire premise of these notes, we have to precisely define what this Liz framework actually is.
Right, so the author uses Liz as an archetype. Think of her as a specific kind of social survivor and like an apex performer.
An apex performer, I like that.
Yeah, the Liz persona is someone defined by strategic charisma, an intense, almost paranoid need for autonomy, and a total mastery of aesthetic authority.
So she's not the one winning the bar fight.
Exactly, no. The Liz archetype doesn't win by throwing the hardest punch. She wins by controlling the environment.
Managing the perception of power.
Yes, turning her rival's aggression into leverage and making her ultimate authority feel entirely inevitable.
So the mission of our deep dive today is to really explore the actual ground-level mechanics of this. How does a state use the Liz strategy to survive a millennium of constant invasions?
And fractured internal loyalties and just apocalyptic existential crises.
Because there were plenty of those. So for anyone listening right now, whether you are trying to manage a deeply dysfunctional team at work or navigating a really complex social hierarchy.
Or if you just want to understand the blueprint of how modern power structures were actually born.
Yeah, this is a masterclass in how systems survive. They don't survive by being rigid. They survive through relentless, calculating reinvention.
Always adapting. Always shifting the board.
So let's start by looking at the physical board this game was played on. The former Roman territory of Gaul. The notes point out that this landscape was incredibly blessed in terms of natural resources.
Oh, the physical assets were just staggering. I mean, in the north, you have these massive sweeping plains that were agriculturally explosive.
Basically the breadbasket.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This was prime territory for grain production, which is the foundational fuel of literally any pre-industrial society. And it was perfect terrain for breeding and maneuvering heavy cavalry.
Right, knights on horseback need open fields.
But the real geographic lottery ticket was the river system. I mean, the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, the Rhone, the Meuse.
It's like a pre-built highway network.
That's exactly what it was. These weren't just geographical boundaries, they were the economic arteries of the continent.
They connected dense inland agricultural hubs directly to the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea.
Right, they were medieval superhighways moving timber, wine, grain, and eventually, luxury goods.
So on paper, the wealth generation potential is just massive. You have the food to feed a huge population, and you have the transport network to trade it.
Yep, it sounds like a perfect setup.
But the geography is also pulling the region apart at the seams. I mean, you have the Alps and the Pyrenees acting as these massive physical walls on the borders.
Which is good for defense, sure.
Right, but internally, the sheer size of the territory creates this deep, deep isolation.
The friction of distance in the medieval period, it just cannot be overstated. I mean, moving an army or even just a royal decree across the massive central or through the dense forests of Brittany, it took weeks of grueling travel.
And because of that physical isolation, the environment mechanically fostered these deeply entrenched, fiercely independent local identities.
Yeah, a local duke in a region like Aquitaine or Normandy, he had daily, tangible power over his people.
He's the guy you actually see.
Exactly. He controlled the local courts, he controlled the granaries, his soldiers patrolled the roads.
So to a peasant in Languedoc, a king sitting way up in Paris was a completely abstract, just irrelevant concept.
Totally abstract. He might as well have been a myth.
I look at this early setup and I instantly think of a massive, heavily siloed corporate conglomerate.
Oh, that's a really good way to frame it.
Right. Like you have the holding company at the top, the king, who technically owns all these incredibly profitable regional subsidiaries.
Technically being the operative word there.
Yeah, because the regional CEOs, the dukes, they refuse to answer emails. They have their own private security forces, and they're actively trying to steal market share from each other.
I would actually take that analogy a step further. It's not just a conglomerate where the subsidiaries are ignoring the CEO.
What is it then?
It's a massive franchise model.
Yeah.
Where the regional managers don't even speak the same language as the corporate headquarters.
Oh, wow. Right. The language barrier.
Yeah, in the north of France, the population spoke the langue d'oil, and in the south, they spoke the langue d'oil.
That linguistic divide has to be a huge mechanical barrier to governance. I mean, if you are a central king trying to issue a new tax law or a legal decree, right, the moment it crosses into southern territory, the local lords have to translate it. Or, more likely, deliberately mistranslate it to exploit legal loopholes. You have zero administrative control.
How do you unify a map where the basic tool of communication is literally broken?
You certainly cannot do it with sheer military force. You simply cannot afford to garrison a standing army in every disparate region to enforce your will.
No, it would bankrupt you in a month. So the early rulers of this fractured map, they had to find a completely different mechanism to create cohesion.
They had to find a universal language that bypassed regional dialects entirely.
And the text points out that this is exactly what the early Frankish leader Clovis realized.
The notes highlight his specific strategy as a absolute masterstroke of early system building. I mean, Clovis realizes he's a warlord sitting on top of a highly complex, pre-existing Roman bureaucratic structure.
One that he doesn't fully control.
Yeah.
He's just the guy with the biggest sword.
Right. So he plays his trump card. He converts to Catholic Christianity.
To appreciate the mechanics of that decision, we really have to look at the religious landscape he was navigating at the time.
Because it wasn't just, everyone was Catholic.
No, not at all. The majority of the powerful Germanic warlords operating in Europe at that time adhered to Arian Christianity.
Okay, Arian Christianity. What's the core difference there?
Well, without getting lost in deep theology, Arianism posited a strict hierarchy within the divine. Basically, that Jesus was subordinate to God the Father.
Which kind of mirrors how a warlord views his generals.
Exactly. It was a theology that appealed heavily to the hierarchical military mindset of Germanic warlords. It made sense to them.
But the Roman Church had a different view.
Crucially, yes. And not just the church, but the deeply entrenched Gallo-Roman administrative elite.
The guys who actually knew how to run the cities.
Yes, the ones who collected taxes, managed the infrastructure, kept the records. They viewed Arianism as a dangerous heresy. They were staunchly Catholic, adhering to the concept of the co-equal Trinity.
So Clovis isn't just having, a personal spiritual awakening here.
I mean, maybe he was, but politically, no. He is looking at the board and realizing that while the warlords have the swords, the Catholic bishops have the spreadsheets.
The bishops have the spreadsheets. That is so perfectly put.
Right. By publicly converting to Catholicism, he fundamentally changes his relationship with the people who actually run the logistics of his newly conquered territory.
He instantly transforms himself from a foreign occupier into a legitimate, divinely sanctioned ruler in the eyes of the Gallo-Roman elite.
Exactly. He basically co-opts their massive administrative network. The bishops effectively become his civil service.
The notes explicitly refer to this tactic as violence wrapped in legitimacy.
That is the essence of the Liz framework. She doesn't reinvent the wheel.
No, she finds the most powerful existing system and strategically attaches herself to it, so its power just naturally becomes her power.
But here's the catch. A brilliant conversion only gets you the throne for your own lifetime.
Right, you die, and it all falls apart again.
The real challenge of the medieval period was building a system of control that could survive your death.
Which is incredibly difficult when power is as decentralized as it was in the feudal era. I think the modern conception of a medieval king is often wildly inaccurate.
Oh, completely. We picture an absolute dictator whose every whim is law, like a Disney villain.
Yeah, off with their heads. But the reality of the Middle Ages was that power was overlapping, highly negotiated, and incredibly fragile.
The word negotiated is the absolute key here. The sources paint a picture of a king who is just constantly bargaining.
He has to negotiate with these great dukes who sometimes have larger armies than he does.
Yeah.
He's negotiating with the church, which can completely undermine his moral authority on a whim.
He's even negotiating with foreign monarchs, like the King of England, who hold massive tracts of land right in the middle of French territory.
It's a patchwork quilt of overlapping jurisdictions. It's a logistical nightmare.
The author points to the rise of the Capetian dynasty as the perfect laboratory for understanding how the state navigated this patchwork.
Let's talk about Hugh Capet, because he secures the throne in the late 10th century.
Right, 987.
And when he takes over, his actual direct physical control, his royal domain, is confined to this ridiculously small sliver of land around Paris and Orléans.
It's tiny. He is a king in name, but structurally, he is just another localized lord, and honestly, not even the richest one.
See, I have to challenge the logic of this era because looking at the raw data, it makes absolutely no sense.
How so?
Well, if Hugh Capet is sitting on a tiny patch of land, and he is entirely surrounded by dukes in Normandy, Aquitaine, and Burgundy who command massive wealth and significant military power, why allow him to exist?
Right. Why not just squash him?
Exactly. Why don't the dukes just form a coalition, crush his tiny army, and take the crown for themselves? The math implies he should have been eradicated almost instantly.
If human political behavior were entirely driven by the simple math of military force, he absolutely would have been.
So what's missing from the equation?
You are missing the crucial psychological and legal mechanics of feudalism, which the notes expose beautifully. The powerful dukes didn't crush Hugh Capet because they actually desperately needed him to exist.
Wait, why? If they already have the land and the swords, what does a king with no real army provide them?
He provides the one thing swords cannot buy: legal legitimacy.
Okay, break that down for me.
The entire feudal pyramid is based on a chain of oaths and land grants. The dukes are constantly fighting each other over borders, inheritances, and resources.
Constant petty wars.
Right. But if one duke simply attacks another and takes his land by force, it sets a precedent that pure violence is the only law.
Which means that Duke's own underlings could eventually rise up and use violence against him?
Exactly. It's a race to the bottom. They needed an ultimate, theoretically neutral arbiter, a supreme legal peak to the pyramid to validate their own power.
Without a king to officially grant the fiefdom, the Duke is just a warlord waiting to be overthrown by a stronger warlord.
Precisely. So they deliberately keep the king weak enough so he can't dictate their daily lives, but they keep him alive because his existence justifies their own social standing.
He's the ultimate referee in their endless tournament of ambition. That's incredible.
And this is where Hugh Capet proves himself to be a master system builder.
Yeah.
He understands the assignment perfectly.
He realizes he cannot conquer these dukes on the battlefield.
Yeah, it would be suicide. Instead, he focuses entirely on securing the institutional machinery of the monarchy itself.
The notes point out a very specific mechanical move he makes, right? He institutes a policy of anticipatory association.
Yes, anticipatory association.
Explain how that actually works on the ground.
Well, during the early feudal period, the monarchy was functionally elective among the most powerful nobles. They chose who would lead.
Which is super unstable.
Very. Hugh Capet circumvents this entirely by having his son, Robert, officially crowned and anointed as co-king while Hugh is still alive and well.
Oh, that's sneaky. Did the nobles just accept that?
They accept it because it guarantees stability in the short term. Nobody wants a succession crisis. But legally, Hugh Capet is quietly turning a chaotic elective position into a rigid hereditary right.
He isn't building an empire of land. He is building an empire of law.
Exactly. And the notes explicitly link this to the Liz strategy. The author describes Liz as someone who prefers doing less work to achieve a desired outcome.
And they're very careful to say this isn't laziness. It is an obsession with leverage.
Hugh Capet embodies this perfectly. I mean, fighting a dozen powerful dukes requires massive amounts of work, blood, and money with a huge probability of failure.
But becoming the indispensable hereditary source of their social and legal prestige, that requires almost no military effort.
Right, but it permanently alters the gravity of the entire system in your favor. It is the ultimate efficiency of effort.
If you successfully position yourself as the ultimate source of legitimacy, you don't even have to chase down the nobles to extract loyalty.
No, their own ambitions will force them to come to you. They need your royal seal on their marriage contracts. They need your arbitration in their border disputes.
You basically create a centralized system where their decentralized ambition fuels your authority. It's a brilliant trap.
It really is. But the reality is, you can't run a state purely on prestige and royal seals forever.
No, leverage is a fantastic psychological tool, but eventually the monarchy needed to build actual administrative muscle.
They needed hard resources, which means we had to dive into the economic engine of medieval France.
And that engine was deeply agrarian and rigidly stratified. I mean, to understand how the state eventually broke free from the limitations of feudalism, we really have to look at the manorial system that dominated daily life.
The economy was built entirely on the labor of peasants and serfs working the land, harvesting wheat, barley, oats, maintaining the vineyards.
And the sources make it very clear that this was not some cooperative, romantic agrarian society.
No, not at all.
Huh.
The peasants owed brutal levels of labor, crushing dues and heavy tithes to both the local lord and the church.
It was formalized through the ideology of the three estates, right?
Yes, the medieval worldview categorized society into three distinct, supposedly divinely ordained functions.
Those who pray, the clergy, those who fight, the aristocratic nobility, and those who work, the vast, sweeping majority of the population tied to agricultural labor.
Exactly.
I look at the mechanics of this system, and it is incredibly hard not to see it as an elaborate, generation-spanning protection racket.
A protection racket.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The lord sits in a fortified stone box. He tells the peasant, you will farm my land, you will grind your grain in my mill, and pay me a fee to do it. You will give me a massive percentage of your harvest.
Right, the extraction is heavy.
And in exchange, when the lord from the next valley over comes to pillage this village, I will let you hide inside my stone box.
That analogy is super common, but it actually fails to capture the true existential terror of the early Middle Ages.
Okay, how does the source material nuance this?
It wasn't a cynical shakedown orchestrated by men in suits. It was a desperate structure of survival in an era completely devoid of centralized state protection.
Because there's no police force.
Right. Before the kings built standing armies or national police forces, a peasant village without a martial lord was completely defenseless against roaming mercenaries, Viking raids, or just neighboring militias.
So it's either pay the lord or die to the raiders.
Pretty much. The extraction of their labor was severe, yes, but the violence they would have faced without the lord's protection was absolute. The system was brutal, but it offered a functional, localized stability.
Okay, I see that. But that local stability is precisely what kept the central monarchy relatively weak, isn't it?
Exactly. As long as the economy is purely agrarian and localized, the lord holds all the cards.
Because the king can't exactly tax a turnip harvest directly, the logistics just don't work.
No, you can't transport thousands of turnips to Paris before they rot. So what changes? The notes heavily emphasize a dynamic shift beginning in the 11th century.
What's the catalyst?
It's the slow, grinding return of long-distance trade and the monetization of the economy. We start to see agricultural innovations, like the heavy plow and three-field crop rotation.
Which creates massive food surpluses.
Exactly. And a surplus means not everyone has to farm. This allows for the resurgence of urban centers and the creation of mercantile networks.
The notes specifically highlight the fairs of Champagne as the mechanical turning point here. Let's explain this, because when I hear fair, I picture a local farmer's market with some livestock and funnel cake.
Right. A Ferris wheel, maybe.
Yeah.
But no, the sources describe this as something far more complex. They were the medieval equivalent of Wall Street.
Really? How did they work?
The Counts of Champagne created a series of massive, highly regulated trade hubs. They offered safe conduct passes to merchants traveling from all over Italy, Flanders, Germany.
So they basically guaranteed security for trade.
Yes. But the real innovation wasn't just the physical exchange of Flemish cloth for Asian spices. It was the financial technology that developed there.
Financial technology in the 11th century.
Yeah. This is where we see the widespread use of letters of credit and complex currency exchange. Merchants didn't have to carry heavy chests of silver across bandit-infested roads anymore.
They could just carry a piece of paper that represented their wealth. That's a huge leap in efficiency.
It's massive. And as these trade networks explode, you see the rise of towns and the formation of guilds.
If I am trying to map the mechanics of power here, the rise of the guild feels like the first real crack in the lord's absolute power over the peasant.
It was a seismic shift. The guilds operated as proto-unions and monopolies for craftsmen.
So if you were a serf, tied to the land by blood and law,
And you managed to escape to a growing town and live there for a year and a day, you were legally free.
wow, a year and a day.
Yep. You could join a guild, learn a trade, and generate your own wealth.
That economic independence is everything. Suddenly, you have this growing demographic of people, the early middle class, whose wealth and survival are completely untethered from the agricultural protection racket of the local lord.
And the central monarchy immediately recognizes the strategic value of this new demographic. A duke with land can raise an army of knights, but a town with guilds generates hard currency.
And kings love hard currency.
They absolutely do. The kings began granting royal charters to these towns, offering them legal protection from the local lords in exchange for direct taxation.
This is the exact mechanism that allowed the French state to eventually bypass the feudal nobility.
Exactly. With a growing stream of tax revenue from the urban centers, the kings could begin to hire professional administrators, judges, and eventually their own mercenary armies.
They were using the new economy to slowly buy their independence from the aristocracy. That is so Liz-coded.
It really is. So the physical reality of the kingdom is shifting as money and trade create new avenues of power.
But the notes are extremely adamant that you cannot understand the survival of the French state by only looking at economics and military strategy.
No, that's only half the board.
Because the psychological reality of every single person on that map, from the lowliest peasant to the king himself, was entirely governed by a different, incredibly pervasive system: religion.
The author asserts that Latin Christianity was not just a component of medieval life, it was the primary organizing principle of reality itself.
It's hard for us to grasp that now.
It is almost impossible for a modern, secular mind to grasp the totality of the Church's influence. It dictated the fundamental concept of time through the liturgical calendar.
It provided the only framework for understanding justice, natural disasters, disease.
And the ultimate fate of the human soul.
The sources describe a world that is heavily enchanted. The supernatural wasn't a philosophical debate. It was an everyday reality.
People believed implicitly in the active intervention of saints, the physical power of holy relics, and the immediate terrifying threat of eternal damnation.
And the church was the exclusive gatekeeper to salvation. But it wasn't just a spiritual organization. It was the most formidable economic and political machine in Europe.
The physical infrastructure of the church was staggering. I mean, they were the largest single landowner in the kingdom.
Bigger than the king.
Oh, absolutely.
Here.
They possessed their own massive revenue stream through the compulsory collection of tithes. They held an absolute monopoly on literacy, education, and the preservation of legal texts.
And, returning to our theme of legitimacy, they were the only institution capable of crowning a king and anointing him with holy oil,
physically transforming him from a mere mortal into God's appointed sovereign.
This creates a fascinating structural conflict. You have the royal government trying to centralize legal and economic control.
Yeah.
And you have this massive transnational corporate entity, the church, operating inside the same territory with its own wealth, its own laws, and its own ultimate leader in Rome.
It feels like a company trying to operate with two completely different boards of directors who refuse to speak to each other.
Exactly. How does that even function?
The dynamic between the French crown and the church is the defining political high-wire act of the era. The notes emphasize that it was an incredibly tense, constantly shifting symbiosis.
Because they needed each other.
The monarchy absolutely required the church to validate its existence. Without the concept of the divine right of kings, the monarch is just a warlord with a fancy hat.
Right.
But at the same time, the kings fiercely resisted the church's attempts to encroach on secular power.
So they're allies, but they're constantly fighting over the boundaries of their power.
Oh, they fought bitter, decades-long bureaucratic wars over who had the right to tax the clergy, who had the authority to appoint local bishops.
And jurisdiction, right. Like if a priest committed a secular crime, who tries him?
Exactly. Does he go to a royal court or a church court? It was a massive point of contention.
The notes provide two deeply complex historical examples of how the state navigated this religious reality. The first is King Louis IX, who rules in the mid-13th century.
He is a fascinating figure. He is presented as the ultimate manifestation of the perfect Christian king.
He reforms the justice system, he personally leads crusades, And he is so highly regarded for his piety that he is actually canonized as a saint after his death.
Saint Louis. Louis IX is critical because he deeply embedded the moral authority of the church directly into the machinery of the French state.
How so?
He expanded the royal courts, making royal justice cheaper, faster, and fairer than the courts operated by the local lords. But he didn't just do it for administrative efficiency.
He framed the king as the supreme dispenser of divine justice on earth.
Exactly. He made the state and the faith look functionally indistinguishable to the average subject.
But the author of the notes introduces a very necessary friction here. They point out the dark, mechanical reality of building a state entirely around religious purity.
You can't be perfectly pure without excluding someone.
Right. Louis IX's devotion required him to aggressively persecute those outside the faith. The notes explicitly detail his severe persecution of religious minorities, specifically the Jewish populations in France.
It demonstrates the dangerous utility of religious orthodoxy as a tool of statecraft. If the absolute legitimacy of your government is based on its theological purity, then any religious deviation within your borders isn't just a difference of opinion.
It is legally classified as treason.
Orthodoxy demands exclusion.
Which transitions perfectly into the second, incredibly brutal example the notes provide, the Albigensian Crusade.
Very dark chapter.
This takes place between 1209 and 1229. The Pope calls for a holy war, but not in the Middle East. He calls for a crusade inside the borders of southern France to eradicate a sect known as the Cathars.
Right, the Cathars adhered to a dualistic theology that the Roman Church deemed completely heretical. So the Pope issued the mandate to destroy them.
But the notes challenge us to look at the mechanical execution of this crusade. Who actually marched south to fight?
It was the northern French nobility, eventually backed heavily by the French crown itself.
And the notes pull absolutely no punches here. They analyze the legal loopholes of this crusade. If a southern lord was declared a heretic, or even just accused of protecting heretics, his property rights were legally nullified.
His lands were forfeit.
So the northern lords aren't just marching south out of deep theological concern.
No, they are using a papal mandate as a legal weapon to execute a massive land grab.
It is the ultimate synthesis of piety and political expansion. The northern state apparatus basically weaponized a religious crisis to completely break the independence of the southern lords,
Permanently folding the wealthy, rebellious southern territories into the centralized control of the French crown.
The church achieved its goal of enforcing orthodoxy, and the French state achieved its goal of territorial consolidation. It was a brutal, mutually beneficial operation.
They used the narrative of faith to execute a hostile corporate takeover of their own southern half.
It's brilliant, and it's terrifying. But as ruthlessly effective as the French state was at absorbing internal threats, their ultimate test of survival came from outside.
Because the greatest existential threat to the Kingdom of France was sitting just a few miles across the English Channel.
The conflict between France and the Kingdom of England is arguably the most complex geopolitical entanglement of the medieval period. To understand it, we really have to look at the bizarre legal realities of feudal land ownership.
Because of a series of dynastic marriages and conquests, most notably the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the English kings ended up legally owning and controlling massive, incredibly wealthy territories directly inside the borders of France.
Like Normandy and the vast Duchy of Aquitaine.
Yes.
This is a legal dynamic that blew my mind when I read the notes. Because the English kings held those specific lands, they were technically classified as vassals to the King of France.
Which is just an insane political reality.
Imagine the psychological tension. You are the sovereign king of England, but because you own vineyards in Bordeaux, you are legally required to travel to Paris, kneel before the French king, and swear an oath of submission to him.
It is an inherently unstable mechanism. The source text correctly identifies this as a geopolitical powder keg.
You have a vassal who possesses greater military and financial resources than his overlord.
And who considers himself an absolute equal in terms of royal dignity. It is a recipe for endless grinding friction.
The French kings were constantly looking for legal pretexts to confiscate those lands.
And the English kings were constantly trying to assert absolute sovereignty over them to avoid kneeling to Paris.
This tension periodically explodes into massive conflicts. You have Philip II shattering the Anglo-Allied coalition at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214.
A huge turning point.
But the absolute crucible, the event that forces the French state to either fundamentally reinvent itself or cease to exist, is the 100 Years' War, which kicks off in 1337.
The Hundred Years' War changes the DNA of the French state. It begins as a dynastic dispute. The King of England literally claims the legal right to sit on the French throne.
Because of course he does.
And the early phases of this war are an absolute catastrophe for France. The French rely on their traditional military mechanism, the mass charge of heavily armored, aristocratic knights.
And the English arrive with a revolutionary military technology, the mass deployment of the longbow.
The notes highlight battles like Crécy and Agincourt, where the English longbowmen absolutely slaughter the elite French nobility.
It wasn't just a military defeat, it was the collapse of the central premise of the feudal system.
Exactly. If the aristocratic knight, those who fight, can be effortlessly killed by a peasant holding a piece of yew wood, the entire social hierarchy loses its justification.
France is pushed to the absolute brink of total systemic collapse.
But this is exactly where the Liz framework of survival through reinvention activates.
The French state realizes that the decentralized, feudal method of raising an army based on the personal loyalties of local lords is structurally obsolete.
To survive a highly organized, relentless enemy like the English, they have to centralize.
The mechanics of that centralization are fascinating. How do they actually do it?
They do it through taxation. Under the immense pressure of the war, King Charles VII is able to bypass the traditional requirement of asking the nobility for temporary funds.
Which was always a headache anyway.
Huge headache. Instead, he institutes the taille, a permanent, direct tax levied on the commoners.
And what does that permanent tax revenue buy him?
It buys him the company's d'ordonnance, the first permanent professional standing army in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire.
Wow, so he isn't relying on lords showing up with their retainers for 40 days of service anymore?
No. He has a professional military force that is paid by the state, loyal only to the state, and deployed strategically by the central government.
The pressure of the English invasion literally forced the modern French bureaucratic state into existence.
War forced them to invent the administrative machinery.
But you can't fund a massive war effort and a new tax system purely on spreadsheets. You need intense psychological buy-in from the population.
The people have to believe they are fighting for something sacred.
And this is where the notes introduce one of the most heavily analyzed figures in the text, Joan of Arc.
Her historical and psychological impact cannot be overstated. I mean, by the 1420s, the French cause was functionally dead.
The English occupied Paris. They were besieging Orleans.
And the French heir, Charles VII, was paralyzed by doubt and lacked the funds or the political momentum to even get himself officially crowned. The narrative of the French state was broken.
And out of nowhere, an illiterate teenage peasant girl arrives at the royal court.
She claims she is receiving direct auditory visions from saints, telling her that God has mandated the expulsion of the English and the crowning of Charles.
If we look at this purely mechanically, Joan of Arc provides the ultimate weapon in medieval warfare, an unassailable boost to morale.
In an era where battles and sieges were often decided by psychological endurance, she completely rewrites the narrative of the war.
She shifts it from a complex, exhausting legal dispute over dynastic inheritance into a stark, apocalyptic, holy war.
But if God is actively intervening to secure the French throne, then fighting the English isn't just politics, it is a divine mandate.
She breaks the siege of Orleans, she leads the army to Reims, and she stands next to Charles VII as he is finally anointed and crowned, fulfilling that crucial requirement of divine legitimacy we talked about earlier.
She does exactly what the state needs her to do.
But the notes offer a deeply cynical, brilliant analysis of what happens next.
The author points out the cold, bureaucratic reality of the state. Joan of Arc was a visionary, but visionaries are inherently uncontrollable.
Once Charles VII had his crown, his objectives shifted. He needed to negotiate treaties. He needed to consolidate his administration.
You cannot conduct delicate geopolitical diplomacy when your army is being led by a religious zealot who claims God demands total annihilation of the enemy.
She transitioned from an asset to a massive political liability.
And when she is eventually captured by factions allied with the English who put her on trial for heresy.
The French state, the king she literally put on the throne, does absolutely nothing to save her.
They calculate that intervening to save a condemned heretic would completely unravel the pristine divine legitimacy she had just helped them secure.
The political machinery of the state ruthlessly abstracted the narrative value she provided, and once that narrative was secure, they allowed her to be consumed by her enemies.
As the notes say, she's the ultimate intersection of myth, faith, and political tragedy.
It is the darkest, most effective application of the Liz strategy. You use the chaotic energy of others to elevate your own position, and then you cleanly detach when they become a threat to your stability.
It's ruthless.
This deep dive into the manipulation of narrative leads us perfectly into the core thesis of the entire source document, the ultimate survival mechanism of medieval France, the weaponization of aesthetics and perception.
This is really the ideological peak of the notes. The author argues that the French state survived precisely because it treated power as an art form.
The Liz subpersonality is defined by an obsession with aesthetic authority.
The Kingdom of France understood that raw military power is expensive, exhausting, and fragile. But perceived power, an aura of inevitable, unshakable authority, is incredibly resilient.
The notes argue that the entire cultural output of France during this period was a deliberate, calculated performance of dominance.
We're talking about the invention of Gothic architecture, the soaring cathedrals, the intricate stained glass.
We're talking about the literature, the troubadour poetry, the sprawling Arthurian romances, the highly codified rules of courtly love.
We have to unpack the mechanics of Gothic architecture to truly understand this. Prior to this, Romanesque churches were heavy, dark, and defensive.
Like bunkers.
Exactly. But the innovation of the flying buttress allowed architects to build massive, soaring walls composed almost entirely of glass.
To the medieval mind, light was not just a physical property, it was the literal, physical manifestation of God's presence.
When a French king builds a Gothic cathedral, like the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, he is utilizing advanced engineering to physically capture divine light.
I love how the notes frame this. Imagine you are a rebellious duke. You technically have more soldiers than the king, but you are summoned to Paris.
And you walk into this massive, impossible structure of glass and light.
The king is sitting on a raised dais, surrounded by incense, chanting choirs, and relics of the crucifixion. The sheer sensory overload is designed to crush your ego.
It is psychological warfare masquerading as piety. The architecture, the elaborate rituals of the court, the anointing ceremonies, they are all mechanisms designed to make the king's authority feel like a fundamental law of physics.
As the source states, beauty was not decorative, it was persuasive.
They created an environment where challenging the monarchy felt intellectually and spiritually impossible.
And the avatar for this total mastery of perception is King Philip IV, who rules from 1285 to 1314. The notes describe him with a phrase I never thought I would hear applied to a medieval monarch.
They call him Liz-coded.
Liz-coded. It is a striking modernization, but mechanically it is perfectly accurate.
Philip IV operated with a cold, terrifyingly calculating efficiency. He understood exactly how to manipulate legal and religious narratives to destroy his rivals.
The two examples the notes give are spectacular. First, he destroys the Knights Templar.
Now, the Templars were a massive, wealthy, highly trained international military order.
But Philip IV owes them a massive amount of money that he cannot repay. So what does he do? He doesn't fight them on a battlefield?
He fights them with narrative. He launches a sudden, highly coordinated legal strike across the entire country,
arresting the leadership of the Templars on completely fabricated charges of heresy, blasphemy, and corruption.
He uses the Inquisition to extract forced confessions. He legally annihilates the most powerful military order in Europe simply because he needed to default on his national debt.
And he uses the aesthetic of religious purity to justify it. It's stunning.
But his absolute masterpiece of the Liz strategy is his conflict with the papacy itself.
The Pope tries to assert absolute supremacy over all secular kings. Philip doesn't just write an angry letter back.
No, he sends his agents to Italy, they physically assault the Pope, and shortly afterward, Philip engineers the election of a French pope.
And physically relocates the entire headquarters of the Catholic Church from Rome to the city of Avignon, right on the French border.
The Avignon papacy is the ultimate aesthetic triumph. For nearly 70 years, the French crown effectively holds the leadership of the global church hostage.
Philip didn't dismantle the church's authority, he hijacked it.
He captured the ultimate source of divine prestige and put it in his own pocket, ensuring that the voice of God effectively spoke with a French accent.
He managed the global perception of power while consolidating absolute tangible control at home. It is a breathtaking display of structural manipulation.
It really is.
But the fascinating thing about history is that no matter how perfectly you design your aesthetic authority, no matter how brilliantly you manage your political narratives,
you cannot negotiate with biology.
Exactly. And that brings us to the great shocks of the 14th century and the realization of how the Middle Ages actually ended.
The popular conception of historical eras is that they end with a sudden, dramatic collapse, We picture the fall of Rome, with barbarians storming the gates.
But the source material is adamant that the French medieval system did not fall in that traditional sense. It experienced a series of apocalyptic shocks that forced it to fundamentally mutate.
The shocks are staggering. Right in the middle of the devastating Hundred Years' War, the Black Death arrives in 1347.
It is a biological apocalypse. The plague wipes out anywhere from a third to half of the entire population of Europe in a matter of years. Entire villages are emptied.
To understand how this changed the state, we have to look at the economic mechanics. We discussed the manorial system, where the lord's power was based on his absolute control over an abundant supply of peasant labor.
The Black Death completely breaks that Malthusian trap. Suddenly, labor is incredibly scarce.
The law of supply and demand violently hits the feudal system.
The surviving peasants look around and realize their labor is suddenly incredibly valuable. They start demanding higher wages, lower rents, and better conditions.
The nobility panics. They try to pass strict laws, capping wages, and forcing peasants to stay on the land, which immediately triggers massive, bloody peasant revolts like the Jacquerie in France.
The old skin of the feudal system is tearing apart. It can no longer contain the demographic and economic realities of the world.
But the central state does not collapse. It evolves.
The French monarchy uses the chaos of the plague and the peasant revolts to further centralize its own power.
They position the royal government as the only entity capable of restoring order in a world gone completely mad.
They use the crisis to strip the remaining independent nobles of their power, absorbing them into the royal court where they can be controlled.
They shift from a fractured feudal patchwork into a highly centralized, bureaucratic, early modern state. They survive the apocalypse by absorbing its energy and reinventing their own structure.
And that profound reinvention brings us to the ultimate synthesis of what we've unpacked today. We started by looking at a completely fractured map of Roman Gaul, filled with local warlords who couldn't even speak the same language.
Over 1,000 years, we watched them build a relentless, surviving machine.
And the core takeaway from the Liz framework is that they didn't do it through moral purity, and they rarely did it through sheer, overwhelming military dominance.
They survived by mastering the mechanics of legitimacy. They co-opted the bureaucracy of the church. They used the chaotic ambition of their own nobles to build their legal leverage.
They turned the existential terror of the Hundred Years' War into an excuse to build a permanent tax base and a standing army.
They understood the deep lesson of the notes. History is not a story. It is a competition of narratives.
Whether you are a medieval king trying to unite a fractured continent or you are a modern individual trying to navigate a brutal corporate hierarchy, the strategy remains shockingly identical.
You don't have to be the loudest or the strongest person in the room.
You have to be the one who controls the narrative, who understands the underlying mechanics of the system, and who knows how to make your authority feel entirely inevitable.
It is the mastery of adaptation. You build alliances not based on friendship, but on mutual structural necessity.
You use aesthetics and perception to project a reality that others simply accept as truth.
And when a crisis hits that shatters the existing rules, you don't fight to preserve the old system. You write the rules for the new one.
Which leaves me with a final thought, something I really want you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your week.
Think about the massive, seemingly untouchable institutions that dominate our reality right now.
Global governments, massive tech monopolies, international financial systems. Today, they are facing their own Black Death and 100 Years' War-level disruptions.
Look at the terrifying speed of artificial intelligence, the looming structural pressures of climate change, the fracturing of global supply chains.
Based on everything we just unpacked about how the French state survived by shedding its skin and centralizing power during a crisis, are these modern institutions actually breaking down under the pressure?
Or are we simply watching them quietly use this chaos to write the rules for a brand new, highly centralized, even more dominant version of themselves?
It forces you to look at modern systemic disruption through a completely different lens. Are we witnessing a true collapse or just the necessary friction of the next great adaptation?
Exactly. Because as the Kingdom of France proved over 1,000 years, the fortress doesn't always have to fall to the invaders.
Sometimes the architects just redesign the walls while you were too busy staring at the stained glass. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives around you, and we will see you next time.